Clearly, you guys are not very good at foretelling the future. All right, so high expectations, yes. Well, the thing is, my MBA students are all here in the front row, and they're used to me running around, but I have to stay close to the microphone today. So my usual thing, otherwise I'd be like standing right next to you now. Okay, so I'm Andy King, and I want to talk about making ESG research more trustworthy. And it's really a question for you guys. And it's not just ESG research. If you think about one of the biggest problems we face these days is that no one trusts science. Or restate, trust in science has decreased, and a lot of people who seem to be wackadoodle are trusted as much as science. I'm thinking of someone with a junior appended to his name. And so we really got to figure out, how do we restore trust in science? And that has been what I've been working on over the last few years. And I don't know how to make this go. I can't, oh, there we go. So today's agenda, first of all, I want to give you a heads up on some of the high-level influential ESG research and the ones that have failed to replicate. A deep dive into one example, and then come back and have a discussion about how do we make ESG studies more credible. And it can be everything. Maybe that conversation should be, how do we make science more credible? Or how do we restore trust in experts? Something like that. But that is what's really driving me these days. And ESG is an application. So I got in going back into ESG after being away for a decade, because I was trying to apply some of the thinking I was about how do we make science trustworthy, and then to demonstrate it, I replicated some studies. Now, another thing I can say is, you might say we live in a steroids era of social science. And if so, I'm in the peloton with everyone else, and I have engaged in questionable research practices. So my ICO 14,000 studies, I ran a lot of models, way too many models. Really, when you do frequentist analysis, you should pre-specify everything ahead. I didn't do that. So I would guess some of my results are shaky, or at least maybe the estimates are inflated. So I can't judge. And I think this is the problem. We've got a lot of studies out there. Now, this is a completely idiosyncratic list of the top studies on linking ESG, or corporate social responsibility, sustainability, and financial outcome. How did I come to them? I came to them not only by looking at the number of citations, but also web hits. I was interested in the ones that were actually impacting the rest of the world. And so you see, you have Ioannou with Serafeim, which basically says high ESG makes it easier to access capital. You have Eccles, Ioannou, and Serafeim, the one we're going to talk about today, that talks about organizational performance and financial performance. You have Carolyn Flammer's paper, who used to be here, on green bonds and how green bonds are appreciated by investors and then lead to improvement. Serafeim and Ioannou, which is about if you mix ESG data and SASB data, Sustainable Accounting Standards Board data, you can get higher returns. Albuquerque and Koskinen, one more time? Koskinen. That's more of a model. So that is a model about how you can use CSR or ESG to differentiate yourself and how that might lead to a return. There is some empirics in it, but it's not. It's mostly a model. Then we have Bolton and Kapchernik, which is about how finance may be taking account of carbon risk, and some others in here. What I will say is, at this point, sorry, my clicker isn't working. The top one has been replicated, and it doesn't really work. The next one is the one we'll talk about today. Carolyn Flammer's green bonds paper was replicated, and a lot of the results come from just a few firms like Tesla. Tesla turns out to be 75% of the bonds from the US. And if you can imagine generalizing from Tesla, I replicated with Luca Bacicci, Serafeim, and Ioannou, and there's a, I would say, a statistical artifact in it. Bolton and Kapchernik was replicated, and the evidence comes from imputed data, not actual data. It's data they forecasted, and then they used that. It also is related to some ways that they measure things. And there's a group, and I saw one of them online, that is now working on Carolyn Flammer's paper. That's a regression discontinuity design, where you're looking at when shareholders get a resolution passed, what happens to the stock price. Now, when it's replicated and it fails, it does not necessarily mean it's wrong, but it does mean we should be careful with it. And what we see up here is this, I think there's 15,000 citations to the ones that have been not passed replication. And that's a lot. That's a lot of influence on the world. And what we want to be thinking about is how should we be using these replications? What do we want to do to make science more trustworthy? All right, so today we're going to look at that one. And so this one, as you can see, there's the title. And it's published in Management Science, a very prestigious journal. And it's gone on to have a tremendous amount of impact. Here's some non-academic quotes. There's Al Gore and David Blood, Mr. Serafeim and colleague Robert Eccles, have shown that sustainable companies outperform their unsustainable peers in the long run. And here's the commissioner of the SEC quoting this as well. So this is not just impacting academics, it's impacting the world. And it is, for the academics in the room, it's cited more times than any other paper in management science, which is one of our better journals. So that is a big paper. Okay, I see students in the room nodding, thinking, yes, if I could ever get a paper like that, I would have tenure. Not only would I have tenure, I'd probably be, chaired. So what is their basic argument? Their basic argument is that there's a new way of organizing with a nested set of practices, governance structure, long-term approach, active stakeholder management, better measurement. And that this allows companies to perform better in the future. So the outcome of all those practices is that high sustainability companies, these are findings now, high sustainability companies significantly outperform their counterparts in the long term, both in terms of stock market as well as accounting performance. This finding suggests that companies can adopt environmentally socially responsible policies without sacrificing stakeholder wealth creation. This is the holy grail, right? It's a win-win. Is there any questions at this point? Or does anyone want to throw anything at me? Are we good? I'm happy to have questions at any moment. Okay. I'm going to stay at a pretty high level in today's paper, but I want to give you a sense of what the methods are. So this is what they did. And it's creative. This was creative and interesting, particularly for its time. What they said was, let's use data from Refinitiv, which used to be Asset 4, and count the number of sustainability-like policies adopted by firms. Then what we're going to do is we're going to take that group and we're going to put them into we're going to take that and split people into two groups. So it'd be like seeing what students took, courses they took, and then dividing them into the STEM masters and the probably STEM masters and probably not STEM masters based on what we saw, right? So we could count what you've taken and then split you. Then what they want to do, though, is they want to have treatment that is being high sustainability, that's as close to being randomly assigned as possible. The holy grail of science is to be able to randomly assign something. And then from the randomness alone, you can just, you know that nothing else is going on here other than randomness. So now I can say the treatment caused the outcome. There were a dozen, something like that, sustainability policies that's in my paper, and they counted the number that were adopted, binary. So if you adopted all of them, you were high sustainability. If you adopted none of them, and there was a threshold in between. And they actually did it with quartiles. So it has to be, you're in the top 25% of adopting, you're high sustainability. You're in the bottom half, you're low sustainability. You want to match people. And what they do is they match them on observables. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to take two firms that are as close as possible, and one is high sustainability and the one is low sustainability. So you try to pair them. And now you're hoping that the only difference between the two is that the one is high sustainability and the other one's low. Otherwise, they're the same. And then they look at the differences over time. Okay, so then data starts in 1993, and they look until 2010 and see what happened. Got it? it's a good approach. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the same data. I'm going to identify high and low sustainability cohorts the same way, but I discover problems. The first problem I have is I can't quite get the same number of high and low sustainability firms they have. This is common in replication. No paper is complete, so it's very hard sometimes to exactly follow what was done. They also did some interviews with executives I don't have access to, so I don't know. So I end up with slightly more firms than they do, 108 instead of 90 in my top group. So what do? I'm going to take a random number generator and I'm going to take 90 pairs of 90 of those 108 over and over and over and over again. The probability of my getting the right 90 in one draw is very small. But if I do it 400 times, the probability that I have at least 90% correct is like 99.99% probability. So I'm going to take lots and lots of draws. The second thing is I tried to match them in the way they matched. I'll come back to this in a little bit. Didn't work. So I end up, and the paper isn't really clear on how they did this, I end up matching it 5 different ways. Then I'm going to evaluate those cohorts for their performance, just the way they did. Okay? This is not unusual in replications that you have this uncertainty, and this goes back to what I've been working on over the years, is this idea of model uncertainty analysis. Can we evaluate the way, the degree, our uncertainty about the right model influences our thinking? Okay, so this is the result of my 2,000 estimates, trying to replicate their model, right? So 0 to 2001, because 2,000 plus theirs. And let's just stay on this side for a second. So this is the actual data estimated in the exact same way to look at stock return from 1993 to 2010 using what's called the Fama-French method. And you can see the black, I've ordered the coefficients, the difference between the high and low sustainability group from most positive to most negative. The cranberry dashed line is their actual estimate. And you can see the 95% confidence interval always includes 0. So I can replicate their result kind of, but I can't, it's never significant. And you also see the color changes. Well, that's because for some of these matching methods, I don't get a full 80 group. I get a much smaller group. So when the color is lighter, it means the portfolios and analyzers are smaller. You can see that when the portfolios are smaller, variance grows, basically from the central limit. All right, none of them are ever significant. And interestingly, we'll talk back to this, their 95% confidence interval overlaps as well. If I randomize the data, I just throw in randomized data. So now I take these cohorts and I randomize who's the high sustainability, who's the low sustainability firm. I get this. And what's interesting about it, I get more support for a positive and significant result from random data than I do from their data. That should make you worried. So here's what I did for stock return. And let me just say, no case can I find that where it's positive and significant. Then I did the same thing for accounting. And now what you see is giant dispersions in estimates. Well, why is this? Well, I'll come back to that, but this case, this is return on assets. And it's the compounded return on assets over the 1993 to 2010. And that compounding creates this large variance. This time I do get a very small number, which would be positive and significant. So you could, if you'd run one of these models, and that was the only model you ran, you could say, yes, I found their result, or something confirmatory. But most of them, it doesn't. And again, the random data does better. That should make us worried. So what do I find? I find that for a handful of cohorts for stock returns, the high sustainability group significantly outperforms the low sustainability group for both return on assets and return on equity. So in summary, no cases of high sustainability beating low sustainability for stock return, a few for ROA and ROE. The randomized data for all of the examples, ROA, ROE, weighted, unweighted, stock return, unweighted, weighted, always the randomized data wins in terms of sign and significance. And the randomized data usually beats the pair. So if I look pair by pair, remember I have 400 different cohorts batched in 5 different ways. For each one of those, I look to see, did the random data beat the other one? At least 25% of the time it does, often 50% of the time. And the rule in significance testing is can't be more than 5% of the time or you don't have a finding. Remember p-values from your classes. Okay, so basically I would say I can't reject the null of no difference in performance based on my attempts to replicate the analysis. Okay, now, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe EIS, which I like to think about the paper, not the people, but EIS is wrong. Maybe we're both wrong. Maybe we're both right. Those are our 4 options here, right? I'm going to claim weirdly, I think we're both right. And here's why. I think we're both right, and there is no effect. Now that seems like you're going to say, well, wait, then they've got to be wrong, but hold on a minute. They do in their study 6 tests. They test stock return, equal weighted, unweighted, that's value weighted. They take compound ROE, return on assets, and compound return on equity. But there's some funny things about their 6 tests. The first one is that they say they have a 5% and a 10% significant level. But if you actually look at the data they report, that one isn't right. That's a mistake. They miscalculated a significance test. And when I brought this up with the journals contacted the authors, and the authors state that the sentence commenting table 7 suffers from a typo. It should read, not statistically significant at the 10% level. Okay, so then there are some other issues here as well. 2 tests, value weighted and equal weighted. Value weighted, they say, is, and their table is consistent with this, significant at 5% level. Equal weighted, they say was at 10%. Now they say it's not. They meant to say not statistically significant at the 10% level. Now, for compound ROA and compound ROE, they never ran a significance test. So you basically have 6 tests, and one of these results is true. And the joint probability of finding one result, even if you believe them, the joint probability of finding one result in 6 tries is 26%, which is not enough to reject the null. So I would say the data in their own paper can't be used to reject the claim that there's no difference between high and low sustainability groups. One more thing. Yeah.
The typo in the narrative under the table is there. So you can't see the numbers in the table. What do they say?
The table's in the number. If you back out the data from the numbers and rerun the tests, now you have to make some assumptions doing that. It's not statistically significant at the 10% level. That's what I did. When I talked to the journal talked to them, and they said, we meant to write not. They didn't correct the table, they corrected the sentence. And following that, they say something like, and so therefore we conclude. Yes, I can't go this way because I find this a little tricky to explain. Coefficient is not in the coefficient is given with a significance relative to 0 for the high sustainability and the low sustainability relative to 0. They don't actually give you standard errors. So you have to back out the standard errors from the significance test, repool the standard errors. It's tricky. Usually the standard errors are reported. But there's another issue. Compound ROA and compound ROE. What does that mean? how do you get compound ROA? So you basically, you're investing, usually in a stock, you invest in a company, and then you return anything you get and you continue to invest in the company. If you invest in assets in a company, it's not even really possible. You'd have to then assume that the company took its returns and then reinvested them in assets next year, which the company doesn't always do. So you don't actually have the counterfactual that you can test. That's also true with return on equity. And return on equity is subject to all kinds of decision-making, as we learned when we looked at the DuPont method. All kinds of questions about the way you handle leverage. So these, I don't even know what to do. And I can find no case where compound return on assets or compound return on equity are used in the literature. Okay, so.
Can I give you a question, comment?
Sure.
So one thing I really like about what you're doing is that it highlights for a very wide audience that underlying any type of data-driven research that we do, there are a lot of layers of decisions that need to be made in terms of how you structure the data, derive a variable, estimate a regression, put in controls, etc. And I think that's extremely valuable. I have a question. Are you going to talk at some point about the solutions, about what academia broadly is trying to do?
No, you are going to talk about them.
So
Because that is where I want to go in 6 minutes.
So when you think that's a good time, then that's, I think, because journals are starting to move towards solutions to try to unravel this a little bit, I think.
All right.
But when you're ready for that, then
Yep.
That's a good discussion to have too.
So there are some other method problems here that I want to bring up. When you do the match, think about matching the people in this room to a group of people in another room, maybe twice as big in another room, and making sure everybody comes from the same region, is the same height, is the same gender. Just imagine twice as many students out there. How many do you think you'd be able to match? Not that many. And it turns out I can't get anywhere close to the number they think is matching. And I claim it would occur once in 10 to the 67 times. That's 3 times as many as there are stars in the universe. That's a lot of times. So I think I don't know how they did the match. Now, again, no replication, no paper is ever complete, but we don't really know how the matching is done. And I think that's a critical thing. And then the other strange thing is their data, we should do the matching on 1993, but the data the data on sustainability only start in 2003. So they match based on data from 2003 and then backdated a decade. Okay? They say they did some interviews to demonstrate that was true. Then if you look at their data, their own data, which I backed out of a table with Dhruv, and did we do part of this, Anke? Okay, with Dhruv and Anke, we backed out the data of one of their tables. There's no, even their own data, there's no higher return after 1997 for the 2 groups. Because they give you in their penultimate draft, they give you the table, they give you a graph, and we calculated every piece of it and then redid it. So one of the most important articles in the connection between sustainability and financial performance cannot be repeated, and the article itself does not contain evidence, in my view, sufficient to support its claims. But it's the most cited paper in management science since 2014. It's cited by David Blood and Al Gore. It's cited by the former head of the SEC. So now we have even more papers that have struggled in replication. And so now Eddie's question. How do we make ESG studies more credible? Now, maybe I should just say science. Maybe this isn't an ESG problem, this is a social science problem. Does journal review need to be strengthened? Should we replicate previous research? Should journals be more aggressive in retracting papers? And then again, science is under attack. Well, I feel a little bit like the Tour de France. We're under attack. What do we do now to restore trust in what we're saying So that is the question I have. And for people online, happy to have you chime in or ask questions. And we'll pick them up if you put them in the chat, or you can just speak out loud. Eddie, do you want to talk about what they're doing?
So I'll just throw out some things, and again, I'd love to hear your response to them. The fascinating thing about, if you want to use ESG as a data point, is just how rapid it's evolved in terms of research and practice in a short period of time. We've seen, I would say, in academia, we've seen other periods where things pop like that, right? When we first moved into Fama's world and Fama and French world about efficient markets, this type of idea, that was another rapid acceleration of academic research in a short period of time. But one thing that has popped in academic journals, and this is where I think it's much broader than ESG. I think you've pinpointed something that's a very broad. We're moving to a data-driven world, which means that we're attributing a lot more weight to data-driven input to make decisions, which means that so-called academic work is starting to get higher weights. And so we do need to trust it more. What journals are now starting to do, and I say start is in the last 3 to 5 years that I've seen, at least in accounting and finance, maybe you know about strategy in other areas. They're requiring now that your data is part of what you submit and your code is part of what you submit. There's an explicit notion that they need to be able to replicate what you did in order to bring your article and actually accept it for publication. So that's a possible directional solution to start building confidence in terms of this. The big limitation to that is that they're not making it available to the world, right? The journal's keeping it. So it's a little bit more of a, if someone has a question, the journal can go back and try to replicate things, as opposed to, here's what we did, full transparency, give it to the world, and the world can have at it. So we're not in that world, which might be the better world. That's something that maybe we want to aspire to. So that's one big change that I've seen that didn't exist when I started. I assume didn't exist when you started your career either.
No, absolutely. Other thoughts? Yeah.
I just think that if that was the case, wouldn't it be, I'm curious, like, it would be more time consuming to double check one's work that's under question. So how does that change, like, the number of academic studies being published, or like how much it costs to do that?
Don't replicate papers unless you have tenure. It is awful.
That's the short message.
I mean, I literally, I'm sorry to say this, but at the accounting review, I was told by the editor, we don't like it when other people replicate papers. You know, it gets very hard to get, I mean, I was rejected with this paper at Management Science because they didn't like my tone. John's question was, how do other sciences do it? I don't really know, but my brother is a biochemist and has done a ton of work on oncology and things like that. It seems like their papers come out much faster, they're shorter, and the replication process is, much more normal. And I don't think that's true in medicine. I think medicine is a mess, a lot of it. But
it's experiment driven, right? So when you have a hard science, you structure an experiment, right? So you can set parameters much more precisely. If you think about a paper like what you just talked about, Andy, right? Think about all the layers of decisions you're making to define what the variables are going to be. Hard sciences, a lot of times you don't really have that constraint, right? Because if you're seeing whether or not a certain chemical behaves in a certain way, there's pretty precise ways to define that, and that makes it easier to replicate. I think in this world, the judgment is popping up a lot more in how we define things, because to get to the economic proxy from the empirical, there's a lot more jumps that we need to make. That's my general sense.
that said, if I may tell quickly a story, I got into this, what I'm doing now, this police work. I got into it because years ago, my sister, well, I'm not supposed to say that, someone I know was diagnosed with cancer and was told to get a very serious surgery. And my wife came and sat on the piano bench next to my desk and said, they say it won't extend her life, but it will delay the occurrence of the cancer, the recurrence of the cancer. And then she looked at me, my wife is incredibly smart. I'm not supposed to say that either. And said, how can that be? So we dug into this study. And on one side of the study, they did a surgery and they did all this analysis of the tissue. And on the other side of the study, they did no surgery and they had no tissue to analyze. And so the question is, what do you put at the top? What do you defer in the study that was where you, on the side where you had no surgery and had no data, and the side versus the side where you had surgery and you had data about the initial level of cancer, right? You do some surgery, you're going to find out something about the cancer. And on the side where they did nothing, they assumed the value was 0, which is absurd. When you randomize the treatment, they should be the same. So that drove the whole result. And that paper had a grouchy person who was chasing it for 10 years, saying it was wrong, before they finally agreed that it was wrong. So I don't think this is just us. I think this is a common problem.
Which, right, Andy, right? If you think about the healthcare sector, right? And you think about drugs, medicines, typically the gold standard is a randomized trial. That's what you're supposed to do, right? When you go through the 3 phases for an FDA approval for a drug, right? So to have a treatment in medicine approved the way in the paper you described sounds really, really suspect and dangerous, right? That's very unsettling.
But it's often buried, as you said a minute ago. I don't want this to be a conversation just between Eddie and myself. So I want, oh, we have questions online.
Yeah, thank you. So I have maybe a kind of basic question just about what you're doing here. And then on the basis of that, maybe a follow-up question. See, I guess for me, there's 2 possible interpretations of what you're doing. You're doing this kind of Monte Carlo framework. And one interpretation is that you're trying to kind of address the gap that you had kind of mentioned, the kind of methodological slippage where it's difficult to, it certainly is difficult to exactly reproduce every feature of a typical study like this. And your Monte Carlo method is just meant to kind of address that fuzziness. That's one interpretation. The other interpretation is that your Monte Carlo is really meant as kind of a robustness test of saying, look, was there data mining going on here, or does this result survive sort of permutations or perturbations of the methodology? Those are sort of 2 different but related things. And I think that your conclusions do have to, if from my point of view, your conclusions do have to kind of focus on which of those 2 are you sort of doing?
No, I think it's a great question. Well, you probably know that this idea of running many, so Eddie's point, when you do empirical research, people describe it as the garden of forking paths. You walk in and you hit a question. Oh, how should I measure it? Should it go this way? And then because of that, you go this way. Well, then you face a new question and you have no idea what would have happened and the result you've gotten if you'd answer some of these things just a little different. So there are thousands of ways to walk through a garden, and you can then describe the one path that you walked and the one answer, that one exit you had. So for a long period of time, Ed Leamer and people like that have said, we should run thousands of models, in some cases millions of models, and see if we can bound what are the possible regions of outcomes. And when you do that, you can also often map and say, oh, this assumption, this turning point in the garden is the thing that makes the big difference. So that's what you're talking about, this kind of mapping the garden forking paths, and that covers both robustness, because it's kind of like robustness on steroids, and this slippage, this uncertainty about what the previous researcher really did, in my case. But I think you're also right that there are 2 ways of interpreting my data. Is it possible, did the report in EIS follow a reasonable approach to the data, and therefore the answer that we get is sort of feasible given the data? And my answer to that would be, for stock return, looks probably not. For return on assets, return on equity, yeah, you could get there. Is it the case, this is your other way of thinking about it, that there's enough signal in the data so that we would typically, if we reran this, if we replicated this 2,000 times, we'd say, oh, yes, there's something there. And I think in all cases, no.
So if I could follow up on that basis, and I guess I want to offer sort of a quibble, or maybe more than a quibble, because just given what you just described, I just don't think that the right word is replication. I mean, robustness test is not replication. You know, to say that a paper has failed replication is literally to say, well, we did exactly what the authors did and we got a different result. To say that the paper fails a robustness test is a somewhat different statement. It's saying that, well, they appear to have data mined, or they appear to have been just lucky in the specific methodological choices they made. Minor perturbations of that wouldn't generate the same result. And I'm not sure it's appropriate to refer to that kind of outcome as a failure of replication. It's a questioning of robustness, which is, to me, a different thing.
You may be right. All I can say is if we have to follow exactly what the previous author did, we cannot do replications in social science. They won't exist.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. And after this, I'll just shut up. But the other problem is that if one is saying, okay, the paper fails robustness testing and therefore it fails replication, I mean, your interpretation of what the robustness framework should be is your interpretation. There's no objectivity about that, in the same way that there's no objectivity about the original paper. I mean, you're making a choice of, you know, what kind of randomization should we do? What kind of Monte Carlo should we do? What are the admissible sort of frameworks that we might admit into this problem? And then it either succeeds or fails your robustness test. But that doesn't have any absolute significance to it any more than the paper has an absolute significance to it. It's not like, in other words, it's not like the paper is doing this thing and then we're applying this fully objective test against it and the test is failing. We're doing some different stuff and coming up with a different result.
absolutely. And so you're right. It's possible. I certainly, for a couple of the measures, think well, I don't think it's possible that their matching method worked the way they say it did. And we now know that for one of their tests, their significance test is wrong. So yeah, okay, so maybe for some of the other things, okay, they got a result. I can't say that they cheated. I'm not saying they engaged in fraud. What I can say is, despite the best efforts, I can't replicate it. I can't reproduce a result like that. And I can also say, I tried everything I could, thousands and thousands of models, all based on plausible assumptions, and happy to share my code, which is all written in style state of 5. I've never really advanced beyond state of 5, but you know, it's happy to share it. And you know, people can look, but I mean, the fact that there are thousands of attempts and we don't get it, I mean, that's kind of what frequentist analysis is. How often would randomness alone explain the outcome? And I'm saying at the worst, 25%. And for some of these, 50% of the time. We don't have a result, in my opinion. But it's very hard to prove the null. Question?
Thank you.
So this is actually a two-parter question. How was ESG measured in the EIS paper?
Mhm.
What indicators signified high versus low sustainability? And how material are the differences in threshold between high versus low sustainability?
I request that we take that one offline. I will send you the table and I will send you some descriptive statistics. I was about to try to log into my paper. Basically, it is a count of the number of policies from Refinitiv that the firm adopted in 2003, by 2003, because the Refinitiv data starts in 2003. Yes.
So I want to talk about more broadly kind of the question before. So it seems like we are saying that trust in scientists have fallen, partly because all of these papers have been, rejected for what they originally.
That may be the case. I don't know what the cause is, but
Okay. Well, I guess that was my question, kind of like, how did we get to a point where so many of the top research papers have since been proven wrong?
Actually, can I just put a limit around that?
yeah,
We know that Andy did some work on a very influential paper, there's no question about it, and I applaud that we did that. I think we do want to be careful about saying, we now know that all the major cited papers in academic research have a question mark attached to it. Maybe, right? We don't know, but we haven't tried to replicate or do that for all the papers. So just, I think, approach with a little bit of caution, right? We're not in a world where we've been able to replicate all those, but that's, you have legitimate questions about some key papers. I think that's what we can say. So it's a little refinement, just in terms of where we're starting from.
well, I'll give you one answer. No one wants to do replications. If you do replicate, it was in a survey actually done by Rob Bloomfield, who's a well-known accountant, of academic attitudes. Nobody wants to do replication because they see it as a career killer. Which is why Ankit and I are doing one, so that when he sets out on his PhD program, his career is already toast. So, I mean, so that's a big problem. And why is that? Think about the status issues here. You know, you are challenging someone with a paper like this. It's going to be a big name on journals, all this kind of stuff. There's nothing to be gained. So that, I think, is a cultural problem that we have to fix. Yeah, here's another one. We make ridiculous claims from our papers. Amy Cuddy, do you know the story of Amy Cuddy in Power Poses? Amy Cuddy claimed that if you stood like this, your hormones changed and your performance then changed in an interview after the fact. It wasn't just like this, it was an open stance kind of things. When she ran a study, it appeared. She then was written about in, I forget, David Brooks wrote about it. Then she appeared in a very famous TED Talk, most to watch TED Talk, millions and millions and millions of times. You know what the size of the study was? 42. 42 people. When we do a study like that, we know nothing. We have gotten one observation from one experiment. We need to run 50 of those before we are willing to say we know very much. The problem right now is if you do a second study or a third study, replication of Amy Cuddy, or reproduction or extension, you won't get accepted. We already know from Cuddy that was Amy Cuddy and Carney, two people. So that's another problem, is we are way too confident in our results based on what we see. It happens to me. My most famous paper is about the failure of responsible care to actually improve performance after the Bhopal accident, after the self-regulation. Recently, I was told that a paper that I liked and was helping on got rejected because we already know from King and Lennox that self-regulation doesn't work. That's absurd. We have to be much more modest. And we maybe know a little bit occasionally. The question is, how do we balance the needing to be academic and also our deans pressuring us to be impactful and be tweeting and things like that and in the press with profound statements? Our deans are wrong. This is the problem. Science does not tweet. We're not in the thing where we split the atom and then we tweet. We're not in that world. We're in the world where we discover, oh, maybe it's a little bigger or a little smaller, or maybe, because it's all very noisily empirical. We should not tweet. That is not the stage we're at. Yes.
Okay, but the reason we do a lot of this research is to answer questions of the real world, right? Like, the person you know who is struggling with what, to do in their cancer situation or other things, like they're a question. And, the world is asking academics to help us answer them because, we need to decide which cancer treatment to take. We need to decide which companies to invest in. We need to decide as a manager of a company, which policies to do or not do and make real decisions, right? So I think yes, I agree, journal articles should not overreach in their conclusions, but I think there is some importance in translating that and not saying like, well, I only know a tiny little thing. How do we bridge that? How do you answer questions if academics are being told, keep it so tight?
I think the best we can do if we're interviewed is to say, well, I ran this study, and back to Walter, my best explanation for the data is that it cannot be differentiated reliably from noise. And if I were to make a conclusion from this, it would be that we have no strong evidence that high sustainability outperforms. I'm not saying anything about statistical significance. I'm saying this is my best explanation, given what I think I know. That's okay, but that, then tweet that out. Andy King thinks his best explanation is that I think there are studies out there that are correct. I'm not saying that every study, although there are scholars that have these interesting theories about every study is wrong. There's a very famous paper by DeLong and Lang, which basically makes the argument, the only thing that gets published is interesting. The reason it's interesting is it conflicts with our priors. Our priors are usually right. So therefore, everything that is published is wrong. And so I'm moving ahead because I want to tell you in the last 5 minutes what I think. I think there's a lot of pressure in our field. This is back to your question from the green, I don't know your name. The pressure in our field to publish and publish something interesting is overwhelming. So, the difference between having an A publication when you come out of your PhD program or not is probably present value $1 million, easily. The difference between having the 6th A when you go up for tenure is got to be $500,000. It's the difference between being fired and having to move somewhere or getting a year off. That's a big swing. These things are also then connected to, the more you become famous, the more, and you have these interesting findings, you have your 2-word phrase, you go out there, you make a lot, you have your consulting companies, you make a lot of money. And I think also in the ESG space particularly, people wanted to believe the results. And there was a feeling that if I get this result, I'm moving the ball forward. This is good for the world. I actually think it's bad for the world. We can talk about that. Okay, so I think these are some of the reasons. Some things that we can do. Well, growing number of people are replicating. I am now the tip hotline for bad papers out there. Andy King, dial 9100. I now have found a mistake in a paper. Some other people online know what I'm talking about, who have found errors in other papers. So, it's progressive, but it's really slow, and it's awful because you're just treated like dirt. The second thing is, I think at journals, we need conflicts of interest disclosure. Some of these papers in the top ones that I mentioned were funded by industry or highly supported by industry, and that's not good. That should be right there in a banner. We need results blind funding, because right now it's easier to get money if you're looking for a particular kind of answer, and they know you're going to do that. We need results blind career advancement. When you come up for tenure, we should not count. We should look whether your research is good. We should look at your best paper, maybe your best 2 papers. That should be it. The thing that we do now where we count the number of hits you got is terrible. And then finally, this is my favorite, Andrew Gelman and I. Does anyone know who Andrew Gelman is? Andrew Gelman is this, I hope you're not online, he's like, if I'm a policeman, he is the head of the FBI. He is a very skilled statistician and epistemologist. And we are writing something that says, review won't work. Here's why. I would have accepted all of those papers in the top 6. Because when you look at them, they look right. They look like they have good methods. They look like they have good measures. They look right. And you don't have the time as a reviewer to dig in and realize, oh, well, that doesn't make any sense. You don't have the time to update and say, well, let me check this, whether it's significant or not. You're not going to do that in a review. So you look at it, you say, these guys seem really competent and they've done all this stuff. Probably good. Check. And so I don't think we can do it at first review. I think we're going to publish stuff that's wrong. But I think what we have to do is, once you hit 500 citations, you get re-reviewed. It's like sports. We don't check every play, but we check the scoring plays. And we check them carefully with 6 camera angles. Because then now, because for a reviewer, when you're reviewing a paper, 99% of the time it's going to be rejected. Well, 90% of the time it's going to be rejected. So your review is wasted. And then of the 10% that you get accepted, 1% goes on to have anything to meaning. So as a reviewer, you're thinking, it doesn't really matter what I do. But if you're reviewing the ones that have 500 citations are continuing to grow, will make a difference. And one final reason that's important. Do you know what happens when papers get replicated to the original paper? What does it do to the influence of the original paper? There's no evidence it reduces it. So right now, I think we are in a social science which is not self-correcting. We are not fixing our problems fast enough to prevent them from sort of building up. So on that cheery note, I would like to say, I'd love to continue this conversation because I do think this is central to our society. And we may be wrong pointing out the problems. Maybe the way forward is not to point out the problems. Maybe we should sweep them under the rug and then try again. But we need to somehow fix this, and we need to restore trust. At least we need to restore my trust in social science. Anyway, thank you guys very much.